A common axiom is that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Another axiom is that we sweat in peace so that we don't bleed in war. Here at the Marine Corps Association, we fully understand both. That is why we offer through our professional development page on our website a comprehensive catalog of battle studies, tactical and ethical decision games, and war games to ensure that not only do we learn from the past, but we embrace the thoughts and decisions that influence the outcomes of some of the greatest actions of the Marine Corps. We have tools and techniques that will enhance both unit training as well as enable comprehensive self study. Check out all that the Marine Corps Association has to offer on our website. Go to mca marines.org professional development. That's mca marines.org professional development and get your reps and sets in. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you continuing to support our show and tuning in. We got another segment of Strait Talk, so I mean, buckle in. And so I'm here with William,
Audio.
and we can't have a Straight Talk without the good Dr. Hunzeker. So, Mike, thanks for coming in, man.
Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, this is turning into a full-on enduring segment, man. And I think if you just look, unfortunately, we actually were talking a little in the pre-show. Oddly enough, you have to kind of look through the other headlines. I guess that's just the nature of the world. But there's plenty to talk about. Last time we had you on, it was on the eve of Taiwan's election. So you were sort of bringing up to speed on the political climate of Taiwan, sort of who the candidates were, what would it would mean. And here we are, post-election now. We've chosen a leader.
Well, I want to point out, Vic, that you omitted the fact that the last time we talked was both before the election, but also on the Marine Corps birthday. So I do want to apologize to the tens of people who may have listened to that podcast in case I said anything that was out of battery. But yeah, maybe I can use this as an opportunity to get you all up to speed on I think where things stand as we move into May and the inauguration of soon to be President Lai Ching-te.
Yeah, I honestly feel like we might have taken a step back by being sober. I can't speak for William, but I'm not quite there yet. But maybe we hit pause, shotgun really quick.
As I said, this is why I've been pounding coffee all day long to prepare myself to bounce off the walls for your listeners.
All right, well, let's start from the top then. How did the election go? Who's the president now? What's their policy? And then how does that shape the greater geopolitical picture?
Yeah, all great questions. So, I mean, if anybody even recalls that particular podcast from back in November, last we spoke, there was kind of this three-way race, and it seemed kind of split, maybe 30%-ish, 30%-ish, 30%-ish from the incumbent DPP candidate, who is, well, still is, technically speaking, depending on when you broadcast this podcast, but Vice President Lai, Tsai Ing-wen's vice president, the KMT's Ho Yo-i, and then the TPP, the sort of upstart Ko Wen-je. And it kind of seemed like the race was solidifying in a DPP plurality, that it was going to end up pulling it off. And so the election was in January, and indeed that's what ended up happening. And the DPP won the election, or at least we should be clear here, the presidential election, with about 40%, not much more of the vote, which means if you actually add the two rival candidates together, Ho Yo-i and Ko Wen-je, it was actually more votes cast for those two opponents than for the DPP. But, in the way the system works, that Vice President Lai wins. What's interesting is that although the DPP carried the presidency, and so this will be the third DPP president in a row, it did not win the legislative yuan, the legislature. Actually, nobody won it. It was a really close race. There are 113 seats. I believe 52 of them went to the KMT, so the opposition party. 51 of them went to the DPP. The DPP had controlled the legislative yuan, and about 10 of them went either to the TPP or some other independent parties. So the result, long story short, is the KMT had to form a coalition. And much as we see in our own Congress, although the rules are different in the Taiwanese system, a coalition means, we're talking razor thin majorities to get things passed. And that could prove very interesting moving forward. And so in the Taiwanese system, the legislature has already been sworn in and been seated since February. but Lai Ching-te doesn't take over the presidency until late May. And so that's kind of where things stand electorally. Of interest, I think, to podcast listeners here is just exactly what will Lai's policies be, in particular vis-a-vis China and militarily. It seems really strong indication that Lai, as everybody kind of expected, is going to do his best to continue forward with President Tsai's policies, really tightening that relationship with the United States, while at the same time not making any radical or dramatic moves, relative pragmatic moves towards independence or anything like that. In the last maybe week or so, Vice President Lai has announced his cabinet or his version of a cabinet. And I think what's interesting to note, no need to go into all the sort of details, but in essence, it's just kind of rotating cast of members. So basically, everyone who's going to be in his cabinet was already in President Tsai's cabinet. They're just going to be taking on new positions. And I think that's a very deliberate signal to Washington that the policies will continue.
And so I guess not to go down too big of a rabbit hole because this isn't civic Taiwan civics 101 here, but for those of us, like, is there a system similar to ours where checks and balances are sort of baked in, or is this just how people being elected and it just played out that way?
Yeah, I mean, so I would, just to be clear, fail a Taiwan Civics 101 class, but my extremely crude understanding of the system is they do have a checks and balances system. Government is divided into multiple branches. There are 5 branches. Key, though, is that the president controls 4 of those 5 branches, and only the legislative UN remains outside of the government's control. So the president appoints what's known as a premier, and they're really there is no equivalent in the US system, but the premier is in essence running the government, the executive UN, the cabinet, and then from there, the premier, but obviously with the president's consent, picks the cabinet officials. I think one key difference between the US system, the Taiwanese system, is obviously the US president, when he or she nominates cabinet level officials and many of their subordinates, it's got to be confirmed by the Senate. But in the Taiwanese system, that's not the case. So although President Lai will, announce his premier and cabinet picks to the legislative UN, there's, absolutely nothing that they could do about it if they were so opposed.
they're just in receive mode, basically.
Yeah, yeah. I,
Um,
I, I would say, in my not great
yeah,
understanding of the system, the legislative UN is not as powerful as Congress is not quite, I think, accurate to say is a peer branch of the government to
got
the
you. So it's
executive.
not 3 separate but equal.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
What about so you're talking about the cabinet coming on board. Do they have the same sort of um system where you have career bureaucrats that sort of follow along with these people, like, hey, you need this guy, get this guy as a chief of staff, or you need this czar of this, whatever thing, or is it work that same kind of way that
Yeah,
of?
so no, so they there is a civil service system, and in fact, owing to its Chinese origins and traditions, it's an extremely detailed, meticulous system. In many cases, probably far more professional than our own. So you definitely have career professional civil servants, and in fact, there's a whole branch of government that is dedicated towards managing the bureaucracy. Those sitting atop, though, are often always political appointees. So even if they were civil servants, at some point have risen to the level that they've gotten political attention and have political backing. And so I think the key thing for our purposes is all of the key ministers, the foreign minister, the minister of defense, the head of the National Security Council, these people have all held high level positions inside of DPP administrations, the Tsai administration in the past. And so they are all very well known commodities, people I think DC likes to work with. And again, I don't think this is by accident, especially because in some regards, it seems like Lai may have picked people who actually weren't affiliated with, every party, and the DPP is no different, has its own, small subgroups and factions. And he didn't always pick people that he identified with as being as part of his faction, but rather he picked people that DC would feel confident would continue the
Oh,
policies of his predecessor.
interesting. And then, so I guess sort of a long way to ask then, because we talked about this before. We were mentioning, where is the Taiwan's war chest best applied in getting new stuff that'll get blown up quickly, or working something more asymmetric. Um, so when we're talking about these cabinets that are sort of transferring over, it's just sort of you know change, not, it's not a full changing of the guard, you're just sort of like shuffling around the same people as before. um are we going to run into that same thing then when it comes into the military? Like, does that career bureaucratic mindset bleed over then into their Department of Defense?
I mean, it will surprise no one, and by that I mean it will surprise none of the four people that read anything I write. To for me to say that I am deeply skeptical that we're going to see serious, meaningful change in the direction that many of us pro asymmetric types have been advocating for quite vehemently over the last few years. Hope springs eternal. So I mean, there are some I suppose data points that could suggest maybe them pushing the ball a little bit harder on the asymmetry front. For example, Wellington Koo, who was the head of the National Security Council, is going to become the Minister of Defense. I suppose it is a marginally positive development because he's actually a civilian. And so this will be the first time in a long time that the person in charge of the Ministry of National Defense is a civilian as opposed to a retired military general or flag officer. So that's good. But he was in the Tsai administration and he was a key leading official in the Tsai administration. And the Tsai administration didn't really push too hard on that door when the Ministry of National Defense, when the career bureaucrats and uniformed officers pushed back for various reasons I've already argued. I think the Tsai administration didn't see the juice being worth the squeeze politically and financially.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, the shuffling of the guard, so to speak, doesn't give me any real profound reason to expect a radical change in that direction. But I guess we can always
Yeah.
be surprised.
I want to definitely get to this op-ed that you had sent us from the New York Times and just talk some of the larger themes of what's going on. But along the lines of what you're talking about, we had I sent you that thing from Naval News about this new Littoral Combat Command. And it seems like the establishment of it seems to be falling in line with the confirmation of the cabinet members, or at least the good part of the reshuffling as everyone's getting into their new offices. Is this one of these things that is just more, the cynical side of me says, is it just to appease us? So like, hey, look, they're making changes and they're doing these things and they're really thinking about, the next 5 to 10 years? Or is this a no kidding, like, is this a real unit that's going to have real effects? And this is a legitimate attempt to address gray zone activities and aggression.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I want to be optimistic. It is a time of transition and things can always surprise us. I would say, though, trust but verify. And the track record thus far has been more in kind of the way you framed it, which is a lot of, listen, we know what Washington wants to see and hear. We know Washington isn't looking terribly deep when they come to visit with these congressional delegations and these think tankers who all go to the exact same tourist spots and take the exact same photo ops with the exact same officials.
Right.
And so, it's like the dog and ponies we all saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, nobody's looking too hard to find what they know they're going to find, so they just don't look. Taiwan tells us what we want to hear. The media faithfully comes back. I didn't send it to y'all, but not that long ago, there was an excellent piece in Foreign Policy, and it was written by a media person, columnist who's on the ground in Taiwan, and she was detailing all the pressure she gets back from the headquarters in the U.S. From their media outlets to basically say every time some little thing happens to really blow it up and make it seem like these profound changes are underfoot. The Taiwanese people are really fixated on what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. But my sense is it's a lot of them telling us a little bit of what we want to see, and then we just replicate and emphasize that. So, yeah, all things equal, I mean, any move towards asymmetry, even if it's new organizations, it's marginally a good thing. It's grabbing some low-hanging fruit. I would say in terms of the things that matter most, certainly sea denial is high up there on the priority list. So again, anything that moves us closer towards that set of solutions would be good. At the same time, the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese human capital and manpower in the military is on the army. The army is by far the most decrepit and disorganized. And I don't want to beat the poor dead horse anymore on this podcast, but I really do believe at the end of the day, the crux and the foundation for cross-strait deterrence lay in convincing China that even if you get your troops across, they're going to be hammered on the beaches, they're going to be hammered in the streets, and this is going to be a long and drawn-out conflict. And there's been no move, I think, to really fundamentally change that, because that's the costliest and hardest to do.
It's so frustrating to hear because, I mean, since like the time of Alexander, you see that quagmires are the things that bog everybody down. Like, you will culminate a military in a quagmire much more than you will lining up and going heads with, like, the two heavyweights, the two biggest boys on the block. That never plays out, man. The quagmires are always a thing.
Yeah, well, and listen, eh, uh, we know that the Chinese have spent a lot of time studying the 1990-1991 Gulf War. We know they've been studying the 2003 shock and awe campaign. We know they studied the not so shocky, not so awe 2022 Russian campaign. And from those, they're going to learn lessons. And if there is this sense that, listen, yes, Taiwan's asymmetric sea defenses and asymmetric air defenses are quite formidable. But you know what? If we can just cut the head off the snake and really do better than what the US pulled off in 1991 or in 2003, or certainly what Moscow pulled off in 2022. And there's the strong sense in Taiwan and Beijing that the ground forces and the territorial defense forces, which don't even exist, the reserve forces, aren't going to put up a fight. Then that's a really bad place for us to be in.
Yeah, that's not that's not the sense of deterrence that we're hoping to instill, right?
It's like saying I have a really tall picket fence, but I left the front door wide open.
Yeah, or like, oh, you're gonna fight a bear. Well, I've got my deterrence. That's a ham sandwich. Like, what do you?
Yeah, I left the front door open with a ham sandwich sitting right there on the table in the form of, yeah.
Yeah,
It, it strikes me as us telling ourselves the story about deterrence, but that's deterrence is in the eye of the beholder, and it's a lesson that we have learned painfully so many times ourselves.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Let's
So
let's hope we can get our act together.
yeah, so Michael, I know you're not, in the Chinese classrooms when they're discussing these themes and topics, but are they looking at this more as in, are they assuming that an invasion of Taiwan will go unconventional, or are they assuming that it's going to stay conventional based off of what we understand? Do they think it's going to start conventional and then break down, or are they trying to just prevent that at all? Like, what do you mean by, like, what are they studying specifically to, and what lessons are they imparting from that?
Yeah, and it's a terrific question. And yes, just like I would fail a Taiwan Civics Class 101, I would definitely fail what we're teaching our students about strategy in China Class 101.
Mhm.
My assumption, and this is mostly from talking to people who I think know China well, is that I don't think the Chinese are putting much stock into Taiwan's defenses. I do think the Chinese are putting a lot of stock into what the US can and can't do, what the US will and won't do, but they see it mostly as a function of the clash of the Titans. And again, I will readily admit I don't know the degree to which let's imagine Taiwan goes all out in asymmetric defense. I don't know how much that would move the needle. I just don't know. They could be screaming up and down, we're going to fight you in every street and block. And if Beijing is just, if their heuristic, their mental mindset is that's not going to matter, I don't know that that could convince them, but it could still make
Mhm.
Taiwan's ability to hold out so that we can show up in time still better. So even if deterrence fails, it improves our defensive odds. But I would like to think that if we can send the message strong enough and show that there is a real uh, logical coherence to what the US can do and how Taiwan can support what the US will do by keeping that door open. And we send that as a clear signal and a credible signal, meaning we demonstrate, and by we, I mean Taiwan demonstrates this ability. Then I think we'd have to have a very dim view of Chinese strategic calculus and its ability to update its prior assumptions to think that it wouldn't somehow make Xi Jinping think twice.
So it seems like primarily it's China's viewing this as a lens of attacking the United States with, I'm not attacking the United States, but attacking United States interests, with Taiwan almost as like an afterthought. Um,
Yeah, I think my sense is that Chinese military planners largely see the Taiwanese military as kind of a rounding error, residual afterthought consideration. And again, based on what I've seen, I'm not sure that their calculus is entirely incorrect. And I don't believe, we're talking millions and millions of anti-ship missiles. If they can find a way to penetrate those defenses or to get a sizable number of boots on the ground in whatever creative way they find out, that I worry that without a meaningful reserve force, a meaningful ground force, and a capability to really hold out, I think it'd be very rational for the Taiwanese people to, surrender relatively quickly, because they've been told time and time again by their military and their political class, we will repel the invasion before it reaches the beach. And if all of a sudden the invasion shows up and it skipped over the beach, that's a problem.
Yeah. Um, well, I know I won't. I want to definitely dive into this, but there have been obviously, other than the election, we had the earthquake, which I'm so thankful that all of your family that's there is safe. And to be quite honest, I mean, for the magnitude of what it was in an island nation, they seem to have like absorbed it pretty well. Didn't seem to like they didn't lose a lot of infrastructure. I think the loss of lives was minimal, right? I mean,
I mean, really, it does speak to the feat of engineering that this island or a series of islands sits on the Ring of Fire. This is a major earthquake. and the damage was remarkably low. I mean, lives were lost, and we are still talking about a long recovery. But compared to what it could have been, and we can imagine an equivalent earthquake hitting parts of the U.S., and it may not have
Sure.
fared quite as well. And
100.
I think
Yeah.
it also speaks to the resilient mindset of the Taiwanese people. They have come to expect natural disasters like earthquakes and typhoons. And so, if you can train people to do that, I think you can train and prepare them mentally for this other set of far darker scenarios. But again, I think the government in Taiwan, and to some degree, the government even in the U.S., seems to think of war as a lesser included threat under natural disaster. And I just think the idea that an act of God might kill me versus the idea of like somebody's actually hunting me down and wants me dead, I think those are just very different things to prepare
Mhm.
for psychologically and socially. Plus, unlike an earthquake or even a typhoon, which hits one part of your country at one time, this hits the entire nation at the entire time, as it also cuts you off in terms of access from outside resources. And I think that also changes the psychology for both the individual, but also the leadership.
Mm, interesting. And then what were some of the things that you saw, geopolitically, in response to this? Obviously, we came, the other uh East Asian, Southeast Asian nations came. What was I think China was fairly sympathetic, right? I mean, it wasn't like, oh, now's our time, right? Like,
Yeah, no, no. I mean, so yes, I think again, giving credit where credit is definitely due. The degree to which I think Washington and Taiwan and Washington's allies and partners in the region have really gotten on the same sheet of music, saying the right things, showing solidarity without being too provocative, all part of, I think, an overarching strategy, in particular with this administration, to build this lattice network of partners and allies. I think we did everything perfectly according to script. I mean, I'm sure I could find a way to nitpick, but it wouldn't be worth it. I'd put all your listeners to sleep. I think also for its part, like you said, China relatively subdued. I know a lot of experts, and maybe this can help sink us into the other part of our conversation, but a lot of US experts were very worried that if the election in January didn't turn out to China's liking, that it would use the run up to the inauguration to start doing some very provocative things. And, I'm sure there were some US officials and think tanks wargaming all the horrible things that could happen to Taiwan between now and then that China could use in its excuse. And so one would imagine a natural disaster in which China uses it as an opportunity, but it didn't seem to do so. So I think that's interesting. I wouldn't draw that many predictive lines from it, but I do think that's interesting.
yeah, I did. All right, well, let's jump into the meat and potatoes of this thing. Um, so we had referenced it earlier. We had the that op-ed that came out. Would you say a couple weeks ago, New York Times? Um, and you and sort of your cohort have been on one side of the fence of deterrence, and then others um, have been more on the side of it, more in the camp of if we do too much, we're going to provoke the very thing that we're trying to stop. And then, we had this boat collision that we were talking about sort of before we started recording here. There's obviously increased gray zone activity. Filipino sailors are getting sprayed with high pressure hoses from Chinese Coast Guardsmen on every day except for the ones that end in Y. It's like it's insane everything that's going on. And so sort of on this end, we've got a couple camps here. You're in one. There's another crew, and then you guys have sort of been sharing some volleys on how to really think about this problem set, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it, take a step back to the election, I don't know how Beijing ultimately interpreted the election. Maybe a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously, they would have preferred the KMT candidate to have prevailed. That didn't happen. Flip side is the legislative UN does go to the opposition, although it's this composite lash up, but still means a way to check and slow the roll of a DPP administration. So what exactly that means for Beijing, obviously, and I think CSIS had this big report, their China military power report came out in January, that said a lot of experts really were worried that, especially if the DPP wins the presidency, that China is going to take this as an indicator. Listen, this is just slowly but surely moving away from us, and that's a problem. Um, and so there's
Yeah,
this
and
concern.
Z's on he's on the clock, right? I mean, this is his last go theoretically.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, that opens an entire other debates of is China working on a timeline? War by timeline makes zero sense to me, and I think makes little sense to others. But the Davidson window, it is, it's taken on a life of its own. This idea that China will attack by 2027.
Yeah.
Either way, I think everybody understands though that we've definitely entered a period of heightened tensions, and the inauguration probably didn't really reduce or sorry, the election, soon to be inauguration, didn't lessen the tensions, but whether it ratcheted them or not, uh, I think historians can make a case that we are still in the midst of this fourth Taiwan Strait crisis that really kicks off with Pelosi's visit in August of 2022, and the steady drumbeat of potential literal collisions between Filipino boats
Right.
and Chinese boats, and close calls in the air zones, et cetera, around Taiwan and the South China Seas, that something might set things off in a way that no one can control. And obviously, there's a diversity of opinions, but I think simply we could say there's kind of two basic camps. One camp is, I think best encapsulated. So Bonnie Glazer, Tom Christensen, who is a GW Bush administration official, and Jessica Chen Weiss, who I think just came out of the Biden administration, had a piece in Foreign Affairs in which they said, listen, if we are attempting to deter China from attacking Taiwan, a big piece of deterrence is that you also have to assure the Chinese, that if they comply with your deterrent threats, you won't attack them anyway. In other words, the worst case scenario for them won't happen no matter what, because if they're afraid of Taiwan becoming independent and them listening to our deterrent threats means that we basically create a shield that allows Taiwan to become independent because that's what we really want. That's a problem. And then China's gonna be like, listen, if we're gonna fight you either way, might as well fight you on terms that are to our liking. So one camp is like, we need to be doing more to reassure China that we have no intention of supporting Taiwanese independence, and that at the same time, we accept the status quo, we will abide by our existing one China policy and everything that entails, and that we need to be very, very worried about the potential of a crisis that spirals out of control. The other camp, and so I had a rejoinder with two of my colleagues, Raymond Kwa, who's at RAND, and Mark Christopher, who I believe is at the Atlantic Council now, where we basically come back and say, uh, to suggest that sending Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan or President Tsai meeting with McCarthy here in the United States uh, are somehow equivalent to all of these very bellicose and provocative military exercises that China's doing in its crash military modernization, and the repeated speeches by Xi Jinping saying that force remains an option. To say that those somehow are equivalent and that we need to be the ones reassuring China is probably disingenuous and certainly the basis for bad policy. In essence, our argument is, this idea that every spiraling set of tensions in history is the result of misunderstanding is erroneous. That sometimes Adolf Hitler is your next door neighbor, and if you happen to be Poland in the 1930s, you actually can't do something that will provoke Hitler because Hitler planned to attack you anyway. And I'm not suggesting Xi Jinping is Hitler, but I think if we take his rhetoric seriously, he's making it pretty clear what his intentions are and what he's willing to do to achieve those things. In which case, this is not a case of an accident that spirals out of control or a case of prodding him into do something he didn't want to do. In fact, it seems to us to suggest that we just full court press need to do everything we can, and we should be willing to accept some of those risks because at best, it'll put us in a position to deal with them.
Yeah, I think it was it Toni Morrison that said if someone shows you who they are, believe them.
Yes, yes. I
Um,
I, I have a former defense official. I have him speak to all of my classes, and he's developed a reputation. He was called the Putin whisperer while he was in the Pentagon because he accurately predicted basically all of Putin's moves against Georgia in 2008, against Ukraine in 2014, and the invasion in 2022. And people kept asking him, how did you know what Putin was going to do? And he said, because I read what he wrote and said.
um, so I guess in that same sort of vein, then, when we're looking at what essentially China is showing us and telling us, we're talking about um, this. What is it, Kinman, the boat collision that occurred between Taiwan Coast Guardsmen and then quote unquote Chinese fishermen. That was like super ambiguous. Sort of
Mhm.
was on the back pages. If anybody still actually had a physical newspaper, it would be on the back pages. Um, and even neither the Taiwanese nor the Chinese released any real information over it for almost a week, right?
Yeah, yeah. So by the way, on this newspaper, I was actually shit you not. I was on an airplane flight a couple weeks ago, and a guy had the Wall Street Journal, and it was so weird to me that I reached over and just touched it to see if it was real, and it creeped the dude out. But yes, so I admit people don't read papers anymore. What's interesting about this episode is, so by way of background, so, Jinmen or Kinmen, as it's often referred, is a series of Taiwanese islands that are really, really, really close to Xiamen, so to China. I mean, like swimming distance close. There were a lot of artillery battles back during the Cold War. That's how close these two places are. There's a kind of an imaginary dividing line. It's, tacit in that it's not explicit, certainly not in international law, of where the Chinese and the Chinese fishermen stay on one side, and Taiwanese fishermen and Taiwanese Coast Guard boats stay on the other. So in mid-February, there was an episode where, and it doesn't seem like any of this was instigated by Beijing. It's just fishermen being fishermen. Fishermen saw some good fishing on the Taiwanese side of that line, so they went for it. 4 fishermen in a boat. The Taiwanese Coast Guard, as is their SOP, went to intercept. Something happens. Chinese boat capsizes. 2 of the 4 fishermen, and if you're a fisherman in China, you swim. 2 of the 4 drown, and the other 2 are recovered. News doesn't really get out for about a week. And then when the Chinese families are invited over to Jinmen to get the bodies, their own bodies, they've already been cremated. There's no autopsy. And then, lo and behold, although it's Taiwanese Coast Guard standard operating procedure to have video cameras, none of those happen to have been functional at the time of the incident. So, reasonably looks a little bit shady, suspicious. What's interesting, though, to me is that if ever you were looking for an example, right? Heightened tensions. This is right after the inauguration. If ever you're looking for an example of an accident that should just kick things off into a crisis that no one could contain, this would have been high up on your list. And my understanding is that Chinese netizens, were all over this and really angry about it. It really whips up nationalist fervor. Here are the Taiwanese behaving provocatively. Arguably, the Taiwanese are behaving provocatively because, the U.S. is showing that we'll have Taiwan's back. And so, hey, now you have, carte blanche. And the Chinese response thus far has been really subdued. And it seems to suggest to me, at least anecdotal data point, that governments choose when they want to precipitate crises and not. And a crisis that gets out of hand that no one can control is very distinct from a crisis that you allow to get out of control. That's the Simpsons-esque, I'm going to close my eyes and swing my arms, and if I hit you, that is not an accident. That is a deliberate attempt to manipulate risk. And so it does get to this actually rather academic debate about, is accidental war a thing? And what's interesting is this is actually where I think most academics are more risk accepting than most policymakers. I think most policymakers are very worried that if something happens, something can get out of control and their hands are tied. Most academics suggest if you look through history, there just aren't many examples where a state literally had no choice but to go to war, that war was always ultimately a choice. And yes, all sorts of reasons after the fact for a political leader to act as though their hands are tied and they had no choice, especially if it goes sideways on them. But as we're heading into like the future with U.S.-China relations, I think, and certainly my co-authors and I think, that we should be more risk accepting and recognizing that, at the end of the day, if war were to happen, it was because one side or the other or both opted to do it, and not because, boats are going to collide in the dark, spiraling things off.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it very interesting too, because I mean, quite honest, until we talked, I was sort of in that camp that, accidental war was kind of on the table, that, you got a bunch of guys saber rattling, somebody gets out of control, and the next thing you know, you're in a fight, and then their friends come in, and, I don't know, maybe I was in too many barroom brawls, and that's just an easy template for me to think about international relations. But, I think you're absolutely right that, like, if there were ever a case that sort of flies in the face of that, this would be it. Because, I mean, what an easy thing. If you sort of, you're in that perfect storm for an accidental war to really kick off. You got close proximity, you've got high tensions already, you've got a military presence seemingly covering up civilian losses. Yeah, and so if you were going to bumble your way into a war, or at least an armed conflict that escalates into a war, this seems like this would be the thing that would precipitate it. So, but I'm not the historian here. But yeah, it just seems like as we think about these things, there's so many there is a longer line of causation. You look at like, oh, Archduke Ferdinand, this leads to this, leads to that. World War II, this guy taxed this guy, this guy. But I guess to your point too is that for Poland or for France, imagine a line or not, they're coming.
Yeah, I mean, so again, anecdotal. I forget the year this happened, but a few years back, U.S. forces shelled and killed something like 100 Wagner mercenaries from Russia in Syria.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, again, if anything should have set off this spiraling motion that no one can control, and yet both sides basically tacitly and who knows, maybe even explicitly behind the scenes agreed that we're just going to let this one, this is a mulligan. So, but the policy implication that flows from that is quite, I'll say, interesting in the very academic sense of the word. It has real world ramifications. But if that read of history and the probability of accidents is true, or accident spiraling, then it kind of suggests a policy path forward. One that, even listen, I'm an academic. I clutch my pearls with the best of them. I don't like saying it, but it suggests that fear is the mind killer, and that really this is the point at which we should be leaning forward, accepting the fact that if Beijing were to do something, it would be a deliberate provocation, not an accidental, reaction to us. And I do worry on some level that this fear of accidental conflict is a bit too convenient for Washington. Because in essence, I mean, I'm not the first at all to point this one out, and I just pointed out to the smallest audience possible that, the US is not all that serious about the risk of war in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we talk a good game, but if you look at our defense budgets, if you look at our decrepit defense industrial base, if you look at all the myriad things that people in every single defense outlet have been pointing out for 5 or 10 years, we really aren't doing everything we probably can or should. And if war were to break out, with hindsight said we definitely should have done, then it seems to suggest a nice convenient excuse. Listen, we could do more, but we have to be careful because we might provoke the other side and there might be an accident and then we can't be in control. Rather, I would like to see a policy that just accepts there is some risk, but we need to do these things to shore up defense. We need to do these things because shoring up defense shores up deterrence. And because ultimately, at least vis-a-vis China and Taiwan, we would assess that risk of an accident being quite low and the risk of Xi Jinping deciding that the circumstances are to his benefit being quite high.
So if China's response to this incident was relatively muted, is it correct to assume either that our deterrence is working or that they are unprepared to go ahead and follow up and do something with Taiwan? Because I heard, the magic number is 2027. Is that sort of validating that they're not ready yet, or that deterrence is working, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no. So I think this is the way we ought to be thinking about non-events. And as political scientists, we obsess over non-events. So does the fact that Beijing did not take advantage mean deterrence is working? I mean, possibly, right? Deterrence is really tricky to prove, because did they not attack because they were scared? Did they not attack because they didn't want to yet? And I suppose I would fall more in the not want to yet, and maybe the not want to yet is a function of, listen, we're not quite sure our military is where it needs to be. Could we prevail? Maybe, but we'd like that maybe to be much closer to 100% than to 50-50. I don't know, a toss-up is what they're after. So I think in that regard, that is a very likely possibility. Forget where I was going to go with the other half of that point, but it was going to be interesting, I tell you.
Stay tuned.
If it comes back, we can
Yeah, stay tuned. Well, you'll have to invite me back for the second half.
Well, maybe this will spur it. So I guess along those lines, does the idea then, or do we, as the large we, as a culture, as a military force, as all of these things, a collective consciousness, do we want to continue to sort of use the accidental war narrative because it helps us maintain the moral high ground, that, well, we had no intention of fighting this war, but they picked on us, and now they forced our hand, so here we go, by something that seems premeditated, deliberate. Now you're like, wait, what are you doing, man? Like, you're intentionally. And am I making sense? I
No.
just sort of wrote down some notes, so I'm just sort of throwing this together as I'm thinking about it.
No, that's you just captured all my research. No, I think this is a terrific point. Before I get to that point, let me go back to the question I didn't answer because my mine was like a hummingbird. The other half of this brilliant statement, and now people won't stay tuned anyway because it's not all that brilliant. I just
Well, they're waiting on mine. They're waiting
yeah,
on
they're
mine.
waiting, and I'll get to that. So stay tuned, a 3-part episode. Um, the 2027 point, William, I think is a really interesting one. So that is an idea that clearly has taken on a life of its own. It's called the Davidson window because it traces back to Admiral Davidson, then head of the Indo-Pacific Command, his testimony to Congress. And I think by all accounts, that really was a not even a timeline. It was not stated as a timeline, but it was to suggest that by 2027, we're going to hit this particularly dangerous point. Not to say that Xi Jinping has a timeline and a calendar circled, this is when he's going to attack, but this is kind of when our balance of forces, the correlates of forces, is just going to be at its worst for the US. He also very clearly said this as an attempt, as a bureaucratic stratagem to get more money from Congress. What's interesting though is the idea that this then gets seized on. So if you're a China hawk, you're really worried about the situation and you're looking for some high level statement by a high level official who clearly must know, you're going to seize on that. And if you go back and you read the articles, you can almost kind of reverse engineer how this all comes from this one congressional testimony, and it puts it in a very pithy way. It puts it in easy to focus on. It gives you a date. I don't believe that Admiral Davidson really meant it as like Xi Jinping circled a calendar. I'm actually a bit worried because then if 2027 comes and goes, when do we just relax because all clear? He was clearly wrong about that. What else is he wrong about? Rather, I think we should look at this as 2027, a point in time where our capabilities aren't yet online. China is planning for its capabilities to really be hitting full stride. Militarily, that makes for a dangerous place to be. But coming back to your original point, there's still this overarching political imperative. And so if in 2027, Xi Jinping's like, I think we're this close politically to solving the problem, I don't think he would attack. If in 2027, Taiwan's really getting its military act together and our stuff is coming online, I don't think he's going to attack. So I think that political calculus is still paramount. And my assumption about all political leaders is they want options. They do not want to tie their own hands unless they absolutely have to. But Victor, your question about the moral high ground, I would agree. Rhetorically, being able to claim that war was thrust upon you is all things equal, a good place to be. It's more galvanizing, especially for the American people. But we get in a lot of wars, we like to tell ourselves they were all thrust upon us. I think, though, the key word is all things equal. And I think we had the luxury of seeking the moral high ground when the military balance was decisively in our favor. But it is not decisively in our favor. It has not been decisively in our favor for some time. And the way the trajectory and trend lines are going, it will continue to get worse before it gets better. And so from that perspective, I guess all things equal, if I could have the moral high ground or the real military power to respond and hopefully just deter the problem in the first place, I would go all in. And I would accept that risk that maybe it looks like China's going to spin the tail that we provoked it. But let's be honest, if China attacks, it's going to spin the tail that we're the ones who provoked it anyway.
Yeah, that's right. All right, man. Well, this has been really great. William, got anything else for the good doctor?
Just as we mentioned, that the current state of affairs in America's place in the moral hierarchy, given the global circumstances that happened since our discussion in November, Russia, Middle East, etc. What is, I guess, the impetus of, or sorry, what's, I guess, the how is Taiwan viewing these global changes, and has that prompted any reaction to take certain steps seriously, or are they still sort of in limbo given just the uniqueness of their situation?
Yeah, no, it's a terrific question. I'm going to be spending a month there this summer, and I would hope that by the end of that, I'd have a more up-to-date answer. My slightly outdated answer, which is from my last trip over last summer and from like the CSIS military power report and some other news reports coming out, is my read is still that the Taiwanese people and their leaders just have a fundamentally different threat perception than we do. I haven't seen that needle move much, and it feels like we're in mid 2024 at this point, basically. And so 2022, the invasion, all the stuff that's been happening in Ukraine, I think at that point, by this point, it's baked in. And so I think the needle is wherever it's going to be until some other major shock hits the system. And it just strikes me that the Taiwanese are still certainly more alerted to the threat and risk than maybe 5 years ago. But still, I don't see that call from the bottom up or the push from the top down to really do a lot of the things that personally I would like to see Taiwan doing.
All right.
Cool, man. Thanks, dudes, for coming on and taking the time. You're back in person schooling, right? You have been for about a year now.
Yeah, I mean, Mason moved back. I mean, we moved back early in the pandemic. I've been back in person since 2022. I basically left seat, right seat, virtual one semester in person. So just wrapping up the spring semester. I think I'll be mostly virtual in the fall semester. But yeah, we are back and running on all cylinders, and we've even rebranded ourselves. If you've seen the announcement,
I did not. What is the rebrand?
uh, we we had an old motto, and now we have a new, not motto, you know, a
Slogan or
I,
something?
no, not slogan. You know, the little icon thing.
Logo.
Yeah,
Oh,
logo. That's
Yeah.
the word. Yeah, we've updated it. I don't want to ask how much money we paid to update it. I guess it's up to speed with all the young kids today. So hopefully we'll see our enrollments blast through the roof, and Harvard, look out, here we come.
yeah.
That's news to me. That's my alma mater. Wow. Oh shoot, that is different.
Yeah, if you check the interwebs, I don't know that all the Mason students are in love with it, but I'm too
And the
old to
hell
be
of
able
them.
to.
Oh man, nice. And so you're heading out, and you said in a month or for a month?
Well, about in a month and for a month. So
And for a month.
it'll be a nice chance to really just have conversations and update prior assumptions. And again, hopefully I'll come back being like, holy crap, man, whatever you do, don't invade this country because they're gonna fight you they're gonna
So
fight you to the
what
end.
I'm hearing is potential maybe a live from Taiwan.
Oh,
I would love it only if we're allowed to drink at the same time. The benefit is instead of getting a double podcast in 45 minutes, we'll really be able to stretch the thing out.
yeah,
All
that's
right, all
right.
right. Well, maybe we can put that on the calendar, Vic. Do another a drunk cast with
Indeed,
Taiwan.
indeed.
Well, if your bosses are serious about this, man, they should fly y'all over there, and then I can show you some real places to hang out. We can do this in person the way it was meant to be done.
Oh hell yeah.
Yeah, I think we can put in a travel claim for it.
Pretty sure that's not fraud, waste, and abuse. Pretty sure.
Yeah. All right, man. You heard it here first, folks. All right, Mike, man. But thanks for coming on, dude. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll hit you up when you get back.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much. Look forward to
Bye.
it.
The Marine Corps requires leaders of all ranks to have a deep understanding of war and the employment of force. MCDP 1 reminds Marines that the military profession is a thinking profession. Every Marine is expected to be a student of the art and science of war. It goes on to say that every Marine has an individual responsibility to study the profession of arms. Self-directed study in the art and science of war is at least equal in importance to maintaining physical condition and should receive at least equal time. The Marine Corps Association understands the critical importance of ensuring that Marines are as mentally ready for combat as they are physically ready. That is why we offer an entire page dedicated to wargaming on our website. We have recommendations for both tabletop board games as well as computer games. And for Marine Corps Association members, there is a discount code for Wargame Design Studios that you can find on the website. Wargames are a great way to immerse yourself in history and to put yourself in the shoes of the great leaders of history. Go beyond guided instruction and experience the thrill of wargaming. Check us out at mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. That's mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. Take your training to the next level.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. I am William Truding, but you've also heard the voices or contributions of Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Lichman, or Ty Frazier. The opinions expressed in this episode do not reflect the official stance of the Marine Corps, DoD, or Marine Corps Association.